They told you the moon was just a lifeless rock, a barren satellite orbiting Earth, studied and mapped long ago. That's the official narrative, the one NASA and government agencies have repeated for decades. But I was inside the Pentagon, and I've seen the files they'll never release to the public. The moon is not what you think it is. Every Apollo mission had a secondary objective hidden from the world: surveillance, documentation, and sometimes direct encounters with structures that were not built by human hands. Astronauts didn't just bring back rocks. They brought back photographs, recordings, and terrified accounts of what they saw. Behind closed doors, those men spoke of strange lights tracking their spacecraft, of radio interference that came from intelligent sources, and of geometric formations on the lunar surface that no natural process could explain. Some of those formations were massive: towers, domes, and complexes half buried under dust. And yet, none of that was ever shown to the public. When I first read the declassified Apollo transcripts, the language was coded. Words like Santa Claus weren't about Christmas. They were signals used by astronauts to refer to unidentified craft observed on or near the moon. Yes, craft. Not meteors, not reflections, but objects moving with intent. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong both had their moments of silence on open channels because what they saw didn't match the mission script. But the Pentagon had private frequencies, hidden communications that were monitored by only a handful of analysts back home. I listened to some of those recordings. The fear in the astronauts' voices wasn't staged. They described structures and craters that looked like they had windows, metallic gleams under the lunar surface, and even shadows moving against the horizon. These were not hallucinations or tricks of light. The Pentagon classified them as lunar anomalies of non-human origin. It was the beginning of a cover-up that continues today. One of the most shocking files I accessed wasn't about Apollo at all. It was about the Soviet lunar missions. During the height of the Cold War, intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet probes had captured images of massive, artificial-looking constructions on the far side of the moon. Structures that seemed like hangars or fortresses, some stretching kilometers in size. The U.S. and the USSR never acknowledged this publicly, but behind the scenes, they both knew. That's why, after the early 1970s, neither side pushed for manned missions to the moon. It wasn't lack of funding or interest. It was fear. Fear of provoking whatever intelligence controlled those bases. And the strangest part? Documents hinted that those structures were ancient, possibly older than humanity itself. The Pentagon's conclusion was chilling. The moon may not be just a natural satellite. It could be an observation post, a staging ground, or even a construct designed for purposes far beyond human understanding. I remember the first time I saw the satellite imagery that was never meant for the public. High-resolution scans of the lunar surface revealed geometric patterns, straight lines, perfect angles, and symmetrical formations scattered across regions NASA dismisses as unremarkable. But there was nothing natural about them. Nature doesn't carve 90-degree corners or build walls that stretch for miles. The files labeled these anomalies as potential artificial constructs. Some looked like massive towers casting long shadows across the regolith. Others like collapsed domes buried under dust. Analysts speculated they were remnants of an ancient civilization or possibly functioning installations still in use. What frightened me most was the energy readings. The Pentagon had records of unusual electromagnetic emissions coming from these sites, like something still alive, humming beneath the lunar surface. We weren't exploring a dead rock. We were trespassing on someone else's territory. There's one detail I can never forget: the transient lunar phenomena. On classified logs, these were glowing lights and flashes repeatedly observed by astronomers and even Apollo crews. Publicly, NASA dismissed them as cosmic rays or dust impacts. Privately, the Pentagon had a different theory. These weren't random bursts. They seemed coordinated, sometimes even tracking our equipment. A Pentagon physicist once told me, "They're signaling, but not to us." That phrase haunted me. If the moon is an active station, then the flashes could be communication between outposts or perhaps a way of monitoring Earth itself. One file even suggested the possibility of adaptive camouflage, that the moon's surface itself might not look the same to the human eye as it does in raw sensor data. In other words, what we think we see when we look at the moon may be a carefully constructed illusion, hiding a much darker truth. During my time inside the program, I was shown debriefings from Apollo astronauts that never made it to the public. The sanitized recordings we all know leave out the strangest parts. In private transcripts, there are moments where astronauts go silent, whispering about structures on the horizon and craft observing us from a distance. One file described a transmission cut abruptly when an astronaut began describing rows of lights along the rim of a crater. These weren't the words of men seeing things from fatigue or imagination. They were trained observers, speaking in measured tones, fully aware they were being monitored. Afterward, those astronauts were summoned into closed-door interrogations, forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, and their stories buried under layers of classification. To the world, they returned as heroes. To us, inside the Pentagon, they were witnesses to something humanity was never supposed to know. The Pentagon had a name for these encounters: the Watchers. It was the internal code used whenever evidence suggested our missions were under surveillance by unknown craft. Reports described saucer-like objects hovering just beyond the lunar module or darting across the sky with impossible speed. Some analysts believed these watchers were guardians, ensuring we didn't overstep our boundaries. Others thought they were simply observers, cataloging human progress like scientists monitoring a test subject. But there were also darker theories, that the watchers were hostile and that the only reason we hadn't been attacked was because we hadn't yet posed a real threat. The chilling conclusion across the files was this: the moon isn't ours. It never was. And every step we take on its surface is being carefully measured by forces far beyond our understanding. There were missions that never appeared on any public manifest. Quiet sorties, sensor sweeps, and even crewed excursions whose records were redacted into oblivion. I read one after another in a room that smelled of old paper and antiseptic, each sheet stamped with classification. So severe the ink looked almost ceremonial. In those pages I found plans for covert return missions, not for science, but for recovery, to collect objects, secure sites, remove anything that might reveal too much. One set of documents referred to retrieval operations on the far side. Another spoke of robotic miners sent to dig beneath regolith where thermal anomalies had been detected. The language was clinical, deliberately so, but the implication was unmistakable. Something buried there didn't belong to us, and governments with access to deep pockets and deeper secrets wanted it gone, or at least contained. I also saw memos debating a darker option: permanent military presence. Establish deterrent. One line read, cold and simple. In other words, if what's under the lunar soil could be weaponized, control it before someone else does. Those discussions never reached the light of day. Decisions were made in secure chambers, with maps folded into layers that hid the coordinates of things no one outside that room was trusted to know. The samples brought back from those classified missions told another story. Public moon rocks, the ones paraded under microscopes and through textbooks, have a narrative of formation and age we can accept. The secret analyses, though, contain anomalies, isotopic ratios that didn't fit known solar system chemistry, microstructures under an electron microscope that looked engineered rather than crystalline, and traces of materials with unknown signatures. Lab notes described equipment frying during analysis, detectors reporting energy spikes that defied explanation, and technicians left with a residue on their gloves no one could identify. Some fragments registered electromagnetic patterns resembling modulation, as if the material itself had been used to store or transmit information. I remember a senior analyst tapping his pen against the table and saying, almost inaudibly, "This is not debris, it's architecture." That word, architecture, changed everything. If true, it meant we had handled matter crafted by intelligence, not by volcanoes or impacts. Handling that truth was dangerous. It threatened paradigms in science, law, and geopolitics. That's why the samples were sequestered, the names of the teams buried, and the findings classified under program codes that echoed like warnings. Handle with extreme caution. Do not disclose. After those lab reports, the stakes changed. Scientists who wanted to publish were reassigned. Contractors who asked too many questions found their security clearances revoked overnight. I watched as entire research groups were folded into black programs with names like Lunar Retrieval Initiative and Project Meridian. Budgets that had been hidden in plain sight flowed into labs with no oversight, and with them came hardware that looked like something from a science fiction novel. Portable spectrometers with shields against unknown radiation, robotic excavators built to operate in electromagnetic storms, and containment boxes lined with alloys we were told were experimental. I handled one of those boxes once. It hummed faintly in my hands, as if it remembered another place. We were trained to treat the materials as evidence, not artifacts, and to never speculate on intent. But intent leaked anyway. Briefings mentioned force multiplying potential and strategic asymmetry. In plain language, if someone controlled the moon's technology, they would own an advantage so large it would rewrite military doctrine. That realization tightened lips across capitals. Allies were told half the story. Adversaries were told nothing. The conversation shifted to deterrence, to who could be trusted with decisions of cosmic consequence. And suddenly, the moon was no longer a scientific frontier, but the most dangerous chessboard in history. There were incidents, small at first, then impossible to ignore. A satellite looped over Mare Imbrium and lost telemetry for exactly 12 minutes, while 3 separate ground stations recorded an anomalous spike in background radiation. A classified probe sent to one of the conspicuous sites on the far side returned with image strips that had been scrubbed of any recognizable structure. The raw data, when viewed in a secure terminal, revealed, briefly and then blankly, rows of angular shadows, like the skeleton of a city. Engineers called it data gating, a process we later learned could be applied at source, from the lunar substrate itself. Worse, a robotic lander experienced a power surge and rebooted with a boot record none of its manufacturers recognized. For days, the machine sent back telemetry in a modulation pattern that resembled a code. Cryptographers at Langley ran analyses and found non-random sequences, but when they prepared a report, the header read, "For directors' eyes only." The implication was obvious and terrifying. Some intelligence on the moon not only existed, but it had the capability to interact with our hardware, to speak to us in our own engineering language. And if it could talk to machines, could it talk to people? Could it persuade, mislead, or worse, instruct? Those were questions we were ordered not to ask aloud. What followed felt less like discovery and more like escalation. Briefings shifted from science to politics in a heartbeat. I sat in rooms where generals and civilian ministers argued in clipped sentences about risks we hadn't imagined a year prior. One line cut through the debate and froze the room. If this is a weapon, who do we hand it to? Imagine that. Men in suits asking whether a discovery belongs to entire humanity or to a select few with the power to wield it. Meanwhile, the teams on the ice were given orders that read like fiction. Deny access, sanitize data, neutralize anything that might broadcast beyond secure channels. We were told to expect interference, jamming of comms, sudden loss of satellite returns, corrupted file catalogs. I began to see the moon not as a remote target, but as a contested asset, a domain where secrecy bred paranoia. Contractors who once bragged about cutting-edge science now spoke in whispers of legal frameworks, international accords that might never be drafted because if the truth leaked, the geopolitical fallout would be catastrophic. Money flowed into programs with no congressional oversight. Science labs became armories, and the men and women who'd gone up with clear missions to explore, to learn, found themselves locked into service of a problem no one pretended to understand. There were rumors, always rumors, about an unauthorized encounter. A probe, launched quietly by a nation eager to secure advantage, approached a far-side site too closely. Telemetry showed an approach vector, then an inexplicable halt, and finally a signal that looked almost like a handshake between machines. Within 48 hours, the launching nation reported catastrophic failures across unrelated systems. Bank networks, power grids, and airborne drones experienced synchronized anomalies. Conspiracy or coincidence? I can't say for certain, but I can tell you this. The mood in the secure halls changed. The doctrine of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, felt childish compared to a capability that could reach upward and unmake electronic systems from beyond the sky. Strategy papers were rewritten overnight. Allies were quietly informed of new protocols. Do not probe, do not transmit, and above all, do not attempt recovery. A vibe crept in, equal parts fear and reverence, as if everyone who reached the table understood that something ancient and powerful was now an actor in global affairs. The old rules no longer applied. We were on the edge of a paradigm where humans were not the only engineers in the universe, and acknowledging that would force a reckoning with everything we believed about our place in the cosmos. As the classified files deepened, I began to see patterns emerge. The encounters weren't random. They clustered around regions long known to astronomers as unusual. Aristarchus crater, with its strange blue glow. The rim of Shackleton crater, rich in shadow and hidden deposits, and certain highland ridges where light behaved in ways no physics class could account for. One dossier contained a map covered in red ink, circles drawn over these locations like warnings. The annotations read, "High probability of structural interference." It was chilling. Why interference? Because something there reacted to us. Sometimes the interference came as corrupted data, sometimes as direct malfunctions in our hardware, and on rare occasions, it came as impressions reported by astronauts themselves. Dreams, visions, voices that seemed to originate from the very soil beneath them. These reports were often dismissed as stress, yet they repeated across different missions, different people, and even different decades. To ignore them felt willful. I remember sitting across from a pilot who had trained for years only to break down in tears during debrief. His words were simple. They don't want us there. That line haunted me because it implied agency, resistance, and, most frightening of all, ownership. The moon, in other words, might not be ours to explore freely. Then came the incident that no one outside those chambers ever heard about. A classified reconnaissance orbiter was sent to scan one of the marked regions with deep penetration radar. The data it returned was unlike anything the analysts had expected. Beneath the regolith, stretching for kilometers, were voids, hollowed-out spaces too geometric to be natural. Some appeared as tunnels, others as vast chambers. The raw files showed echoes consistent with reinforced walls, layered in materials stronger than steel. The excitement was palpable, but it didn't last. Within days, every workstation that accessed the raw radar data was wiped in a cascading failure, as though the files themselves carried a kind of virus. Backup servers failed simultaneously, leaving only fragments of the discovery intact. It was a deliberate erasure, not an accident. Someone or something didn't want those chambers mapped. In response, security protocols were tripled and discussions of further probes halted entirely. The phrase contain, not provoke, echoed through the halls. We had uncovered proof of artificial structures beneath the lunar crust, and almost instantly, we had also been reminded of our helplessness. Whatever intelligence had built them was still present or still watching, and our every step forward seemed to trigger a countermeasure we couldn't begin to comprehend. After that cascade of wipes and failures, a new doctrine settled in the halls of power. Observe, but do not touch. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was stark. No more landers, no more drills, no more casual curiosity. Instead, we funded quieter things. Listening posts, spectral imagers, passive arrays designed to record without provoking. The irony was bitter. We had the tech to reach the moon, but we were told to behave like cattle at the edge of a cliff, watching, terrified to take a step. Meanwhile, international backchannels hummed. Allies exchanged veiled intelligence. Adversaries uttered denials that sounded almost like prayer. Every now and then, a memo would leak into the wrong inbox. proposals for a permanent presence, contingency plans for hostile lunar assets, and even talk of weapons designed specifically to neutralize whatever intelligence lay under the regolith. I sat in one briefing where a 3-star general quietly asked, "If someone else wakes it, do we have the right to answer?" The room sat in silence. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the most dangerous question any of us could imagine. There were human costs. Men and women who pushed too hard, paid in ways the public never saw. Scientists who advocated for transparency vanished from journals and conferences. Their careers stalled, their grants quietly withdrawn. Field operators returned from missions with insomnia, odd burns, and memory gaps. A handful developed an obsession, cataloging every anomaly like a priest cataloging relics, and some of them crossed lines. I knew a technician who smuggled a microsample out in a hollow watch battery, simply to prove what he'd seen. He was arrested quietly in a foreign airport, his sample seized, and he was never cleared to speak again. The message was clear. Evidence belonged to the program, not to individuals. I don't tell you this to stoke fear. I tell you because institutions have limits, and when those limits are pushed by the unknown, the impulse is to clamp down. Secrets protect, but they also corrupt. And when silence becomes a default response to the unimaginable, truth can die slowly, swallowed by procedures and non-disclosure agreements. I remember the night an allied nation broke ranks. In a secure channel, a foreign observatory released a grainy transmission showing, for seconds, a silhouette that moved beneath a cloud of lunar dust. The world's amateur astronomers exploded with analysis, but official channels moved like glaciers, slow and purposeful, toward suppression. Embargoes, takedowns, and denials followed. Yet that leak changed the calculus. It proved one thing. More actors knew, and knowledge was leaking despite the best efforts of those who wanted silence. That leak also revealed another truth. The phenomenon was not passive. Whatever was under the moon reacted to observation. It shifted, it hid, and it sometimes pushed back, corrupting sensors, frying circuitry, or even, according to whisper files, manipulating the perceptions of those who stared too long. The implication was terrifying. Observation itself could be a trigger. In that light, diplomacy became a tinderbox, and every instrument we pointed upward risked a response we could not predict. So what do governments do with knowledge like that? They build layers of containment. Contracts, task forces, and committees proliferate until no single person can hold the whole truth. They create legal frameworks that justify secrecy and fund projects labeled in ways designed to lull oversight into complacency. They also, quietly, build redundancies, vaults under vaults, so that if one nation felt a panic, others could keep watch. I sat in one of those rooms as officials debated the language of a joint statement. Admit too much, and you risk global panic. Admit too little, and you betray the public trust. They settled on silence, measured, legal, and indefinite. But silence is not stability. It's an absence, and absences attract stories. Conspiracy breeds where answers are withheld, and in the void, myths grow. The moon became that void, a mirror into which we projected our worst fears and our deepest ambitions. And governments, which once promised enlightenment through exploration, now kept their mouths shut, trading revelation for control. That's why I'm telling you this now. Not because I seek notoriety, but because silence enables the worst form of power, the kind that grows in darkness. If the moon houses structures or technology or intelligence that predates us, then we are custodians whether we like it or not. The choice before the world is stark. Confront it with transparency and risk chaos, or manage it in secrecy and risk abuse. I have lived within that machinery of secrecy. I have seen how quickly good intentions curdle into protective silence. So I urge you to ask questions, to demand accountability, and to remain curious, not to incite panic, but to prevent monopoly over truths that belong to all of humanity. The moon looks tranquil from our backyard telescopes, but beneath that quiet surface, something watches, and whatever it is, it shapes the future we have yet to understand. Watch the skies. Ask the hard questions. And remember, Secrets kept too long become dangers all their own.